Thank you. And thank you for the organizers for the invitation. This is my disclosure slide. I work for Pfizer, but I'll be talking about the regulatory environment for gene therapy. But before I do that, I'll just talk about gene therapy in a general way first. We believe that gene therapy offers an opportunity to move past what we saw decades ago with small molecules and then more recently with biologics to really get to transformational therapies that can treat the underlying cause and have a transformational effect on the outcome of the disease. And that's why gene therapy is so exciting, right? Because it's not treating symptoms, you're changing the course of the disease. And gene therapy is often administered by one of two classic methods. One is giving the vector directly to the patient. We usually refer to this as in vivo gene therapy. Or you take the cells out of the patient and you do the gene therapy outside of the patient and return the cells to the patient. We usually refer to that as ex vivo gene therapy. And so if you look at some of the approved products, products that have been approved by either FDA or EMA in Europe or US, what you see is that they fall into two general classes with three most common vectors. The two general classes are the ex vivo cells such as Strimvelis, which is a stem cell that's modified with a retrovirus, Zelmoxis, which is a T cell, ex vivo modified T cell with the retrovirus, and Kymriah and Yescarta, which are ex vivo modified T cells. And then Bluebird, which is a modified stem cell. So you have ex vivo modified T cells and ex vivo modified stem cells. Now, these are the approved products for hematology indications. There are other products that I think you heard about this morning, Luxturna, Zolgensma, for other indications, non-hematology indications. But there's a second very commonly used class of viruses besides the retroviruses and the lentiviruses, and that is AAV, which is adeno-associated virus. And adeno-associated virus is an in vivo administration of a virus, and we are currently developing a therapy where we're delivering the factor 9 gene to hemophilia B patients, and what we've seen in our early clinical studies was patients who had no factor activity when they were enrolled in the trial after, whoops, I'm going to go backwards. After a single administration, they had high and sustained levels of factor activity that were maintained long-term. This shows 1 year's worth of data, but we have patients out 3 and 4 years now. And it's been seen with some of our competitors have similar therapies, and the results are quite remarkable. And I show these slides, this slide in particular, to emphasize a point that I'll be talking about later, which is that it creates a really interesting challenge for regulatory agencies when you have a therapy that first in human study, the first patients treated show remarkable clinical success. And what do you do in that? This is just one more slide showing that patients prior to treatment had to use factor infusions, but after treatment they didn't need factor infusions anymore. So what's coming? What's happening in the field of gene therapy? If you look at IND submissions, these are clinical trial submissions to the US Food and Drug Administration between the 1990 basically to 2018, what you see is for the decade, or 2 decades almost, from 2000 to 2015, there was a very steady number of cell and gene therapy clinical trials. But in the last 3 years, those numbers have skyrocketed. And so there's an amazing amount of growth that has just been happening in the last couple of years. And that growth is continuing through 2019, which data is just coming out now. The center director for FDA Center for Biologics said this about gene therapies. He said, in the last 2 years, FDA has approved the first 4 cell and gene therapy products and now has more than 800 active investigational new drugs of this type under review, signaling the leading edge of a wave of these new therapies. And he gave an update to this quote just last month. And he said, now there are more than 900 active INDs. There were 106 gene therapy specific INDs in 2017, 200 in 2018, and 243 in 2019. So what's the repercussion from a regulatory point of view? Well, this situation was totally unexpected. So CBER's budget was never sized to deal with the review and ongoing management of so many INDs. So one of the challenges from a regulatory perspective is they have a huge amount of work that they're trying to manage, in addition to trying to develop the guidance and the regulations that are appropriate for these. I mentioned that, for example, with our hemophilia, we're seeing very early success in our clinical trial. And one of the things that regulators do is they have designations which help to accelerate the development of promising therapies. In Europe, the designation is called PRIME. It's sort of an abbreviation for priority medicine. It's those medicines that have shown early efficacy, and so they should be getting special treatment from the health authorities to accelerate their development. And of the 137 applications, this is as of, I think, July of last year, 55 applicants were granted priority medicine status, and almost half of those were advanced therapies, so cell and gene therapy. So although cell and gene therapy is a minority of the total number of submissions, it's a majority of those that are considered priorities. And so it's just an indication of the success. And what is projected is that there will be, although there were only 3 approved products in the United States in 2017, they anticipate that in the next 3 to 5 years there will be 40 approved products. And so, what are they doing with advanced therapies? How are they managing cell and gene therapy? Well, I'm going to give sort of a little bit of a view from the US and the EU perspective. What I showed earlier, the IND submissions, the thing that I didn't mention that I want to emphasize is that that graph showed you that there's been a huge amount of growth in the last 3 years. But what is also important to remember is that the slide goes, or the graph goes back to the 1990s. FDA has been reviewing cell and gene therapy INDs for almost 30 years. And so FDA has a huge amount of experience, and they have developed guidance documents, a large number of guidance documents. This is just a subset here. There's probably 30 different cell and gene therapy specific guidance documents on the FDA website. And so this is just a subset showing that there's a lot of guidance available in FDA, but also a lot of guidance that has been developed by the EMA in Europe. And so, and those guidance cover quality topics, clinical topics, and non-clinical topics, as well as unique considerations such as viral shedding, long-term follow-up, and some other issues associated with cell and gene therapy. But interestingly, the work isn't done, right? Even though the FDA has many, many guidance documents, they just issued 6 more new guidance documents in just the last 2 months. So this was in January of this year. So 2 months ago, they issued 6 more guidance documents. Actually, they weren't all new. Some of them were updates. Interestingly, I'll point out that one of the guidance documents that was updated was this one, the human gene therapy guidance for investigational new drugs. And this is the second time that guidance has been updated. I was at the FDA and helped to update that guidance back in 2008, and now it's being updated again for the third time in 2018, and now 2020. And this just lists those new guidances that came out in January, and then several new guidances that came out last year in Europe. And so although there's 30 years of experience and many existing guidances, the evolution of new policy is still happening rapidly. FDA and EMA are both very active in the community, in the scientific community, working with people to understand what are the issues, what's changing with the therapies, and what can be done differently. So these are just some examples of workshops that were held by FDA and EMA to discuss cell and gene therapy specific topics, such as hemophilia and trial design for hemophilia trials, testing and analytics associated with adeno-associated viruses, registries, patient registries for long-term follow-up of patients after they've received gene therapy treatment, and CMC acceleration, which is when you have very early clinical success and therefore a shortened clinical development time, how can you allow CMC development to happen in an accelerated fashion to keep up with the clinical development? So, what's going on in the rest of the world? Well, although EMA and FDA have been doing this for 30 years, there are many countries that are just seeing the first clinical trials for cell and gene therapy now. And this is a list of countries that, this is just a list of countries that put out new regulations last year. So South Korea, India, China, Brazil, Hong Kong, all put out new regulations related to cell and gene therapy just last year. And most of these are brand new regulations that weren't in place previously. But interestingly, when you look at how much common experience the regulatory agencies have, there's not a lot, right? So FDA and EMA have 4 products. There are 4 products that are approved in both in the US and in Europe. Okay, so there's only 4 products that they've looked at the same data and they've approved those products based on that data. There are 4 products in Europe that were approved, that were not approved by FDA, that the FDA didn't agree with the approval of Europe. And so we're still in the early stages of seeing regulators work on similar issues and have similar decisions and similar outcomes. And so harmonization from a regulatory perspective, helping regulators or seeing regulators think about cell and gene therapy the same way and apply the same standards to review is something that we're very interested in seeing move forward. And so this is called harmonization. That's the term that we use in the regulatory world. And right now, advanced therapies aren't very engaged in existing harmonization efforts, such as the International Conference on Harmonization and the I just blanking on what MRA stands for. It's the Mutual Recognition Agreement, which is the for inspections. So right now they're excluded, but there are efforts to start having harmonization of regulatory practices between the countries. The first ICH document was just agreed to be developed. So it's not developed, it's just agreed to start developing it for biodistribution of studies for gene therapy. But you know, the ICH process is a five-step process that usually takes about 5 years, and so it will be many years before we see even just the first document for harmonized gene therapy regulation.
Dr. Wonnacott, 2 minutes.
Thank you. And so in the what you see is that countries are looking to accelerate these products, but the way FDA regulates, the way Europe regulates, the way Japan regulates, and the rest of the world, there's still a lot that is not in alignment. And there are other areas where these countries are working together, such as those listed on this slide, the IPRF, APEC, Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee, the Pan-American Drug Regulatory Harmonization Committee. But this is the key point that I want to leave you with. There are a large number of clinical trials ongoing around the world, with decades of clinical trial experience with gene therapy, the vast majority of that being in the US and EU. But there are few marketed gene therapy products and none that were approved in multiple regions before 2018. The number of advanced therapy clinical trials is growing rapidly, and there has been significant investment in gene therapy recently. Experienced regions have many guidelines and experienced staff and can be a great guide to those developing frameworks and making regulatory decisions. And harmonization will greatly facilitate growth of the field, but ICH may be too slow to keep up with the pace of change. And I think I'll skip the challenges. Maybe we can discuss this in the session this afternoon. But you know, what we see is accelerated development with timeline compression. You have questions about the durability of these therapies, immunity against these therapies, how to use biomarkers, how to develop innovative clinical trials because of their the early success that we're seeing. What do you do with genetically modified organism requirements, companion diagnostics? Do we have enough manufacturing capacity? Are the regulatory processes enough? And then these are some of the CMC issues. But I'll conclude by saying that these are transformational products. They will make a huge difference in the lives of the patients. But regulatory requirements are just one of many factors that are going to lead to access of gene therapy to patients. We need to be working with insurance companies and HTA bodies, registries, healthcare providers, patients, and us as product developers to make sure that we create the environment that allows for success of this field. And so with that, I'll conclude and say thank you.
We will open the floor for the question. Question to Dr. Wonnacott.
Thank you very much. I think with your experience from the FDA to Novartis to Pfizer, I think that really gives you a solid ground. My question, or maybe a comment, when you talk about the regulatory policy, because we tend to sort of, we're new at this here in Saudi Arabia, where does it stem from? Is it from the FDA, or is it from these large, the large companies that are actually producing this? That's one question. And the second is, which do you feel is more flexible or easier to get something approved? Is it the US FDA or is it the EMA?
Yeah, so those are great questions. So I'll answer the first question by saying that, who has driven development of the policy more, the pharmaceutical industry or the regulators? Well, the first thing you have to remember is that the growth and the investment in the field didn't start until 3-4 years ago, right? So for the first 15 years, it was academic scientists and regulators. And so FDA was working with academics for pretty much the whole time I was at FDA, the 13 years I spent at FDA, there were no large pharma companies involved, no Pfizers, no Novartises, they weren't involved. And so it really was the regulators that drove the development of the policy. Now that there are many more pharmaceutical companies involved, I think the FDA has always been pretty good about taking input from all stakeholders, including pharmaceutical companies, including academic scientists. The second part of your question was, what are the differences between Europe and EU, or Europe and US in terms of ease of approval? I think let me just say that it's a little bit subjective, right? It depends is the right answer, but I will say in general, the Europe tends to be a little bit more flexible in terms of clinical, the acceptability of the clinical package. US tends to be more flexible in terms of the flexibility around the manufacturing package.